Thanks for staying with us. The uncomfortable issue of slavery reparations has again been brought up on the international stage. Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo made the bold demand during his address at the United Nations General Assembly currently in session. President Akufo-Addo says African countries should receive their reparations for the historical injustices of the transatlantic slave trade. For more on the story, I'm joined now by Africa analyst David Otto, who joins us live. A very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for your time. For centuries on end, there's been this unwillingness to confront the consequences of slave trade. How significant is President Nana Akufo-Addo's demand, especially considering that it's not the first time he's spoken about it?
Well, but it's also not the first time that an African leader is talking about the need for the Western countries and the United States to pay reparations. And I think critically it's important to understand that where a country has benefited from, the theft of mineral resources, but also from humans, in a very savage manner. I think the president talks about Europe having been built on the tears, blood and horror of Africans. So I think it's quite important to make this request that reparations must be paid. But again, I think, this has to be an African whole agenda, and the president of Ghana talks about the fact that there will be a conference which has been sponsored by the African Union to talk about these issues and come up with a plan on how this is going to happen. But it's not the only thing on the agenda. They talk about the theme of rebuilding trust, and Africans want to see that an architecture like the United Nations is fit for purpose and allows African countries a very strong position, especially as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. So much is at stake as we speak.
He said that reparations must be paid and emphasizing that while no money will make up for the horrors of slave trade, it would make the point that millions of productive Africans were put to work without compensation. I mean, that in itself speaks to really perhaps attempting to right some wrongs.
Well, of course, it is attempting to right some wrongs. But I have to be clear, I don't think that even if the West or the European states were to agree to pay these reparations, it will make any difference in terms of the state of development that Africa has at this point in time. It will still require good institutions. It will still require leaders that can represent the voices of the people and develop their country. I am not entirely sure that the underdevelopment of Africa is down to the fact that Africa lacked the financial resources. But I think what Africa needs, it's proper management. And we still have the required human capital and, of course, natural resources to become the go-to continent in the entire world. So, yes, we agree that punishments must be meted, perhaps in the form of reparations against the West and European states for the crime against humanity that was contained in the 400 years of slavery. But I still don't believe that would be the golden, bullet, to drive Africa into some kind of a development at the state at which Europe is. We still need, proper institutions, and we still need good leadership in the continent to have some form of development as we do desire.
So in terms of trying to get some sort of reaction here, I mean, what would essentially be the right response? Because we know that Ghana was one of the points of departure for many of those enslaved in West Africa. And according to the UN, the transatlantic slave trade, which of course affected millions of Africans, was the largest forced migration in history and one of the most inhumane. What kind of response is needed in this regard?
Well, I think the response that is needed is one that has unanimity, from perhaps the Western and the United States, agreeing to come up with, a reparation fee. I don't know how they're going to come up with that in terms of the amount that will be paid. I'm not too sure that African leaders have been able to put up a plan in terms of how much reparations are being owed to Africa as a result of this bastardized practice of slavery. So there has to be some kind of a framework being worked out between the African Union and perhaps, the United Nations will set up a special committee to look into that reparation. But again, I think what is important here is to understand that what is this money going to be used for, if at all it is being paid. We're still talking about, it being used for development, being distributed to the 54 countries, perhaps because no African country, was left, unaffected as a result. I mean, some were more affected than others. But I think the key question is, do we really need that money, that reparation money, to develop our continent? I mean, bearing in mind that we still do have the leverage in terms of mineral resources, we still need to develop an architecture where we can protect what we have in the continent. And to do that, I still insist that we still need good leadership, we need good institutions, we need to deal with the issues of corruption, if indeed we are to benefit from any funds that come in as a result of reparations.
And compensation is only but one of the many parts of the reparation mix, so to speak. I mean, there's also it can come in other forms like rehabilitation and restitution. Do you think that it would be important to consider a mix of some form, or is compensation the ultimate solution to perhaps some of the biggest challenges across the continent? I mean, you speak about infrastructure. That in itself is massive in terms of a challenge in Africa.
Well, you're right. Compensation is one part of it. But of course, we're still talking about, as you rightly mentioned, some form of, rehabilitation or some kind of creating of awareness on how slave trade affected the continent. We still see the impact of that. A lot of African countries are still dependent on Europe because, of course, the institutions that were left behind by the European states that, came to Africa to, either take away our brothers, our forefathers, or perhaps, take away our resources. Those institutions are still there, and we're still having an impact of a situation where, for example, in the central and the Sahelian part of Africa, talking about countries like Sudan and Egypt, we have seen an increase in military coup d'etats, something that, has been down to the system of governance, which, African countries have embraced as a result of their fragility and as a result of them not being able to have a say in terms of what system of governance, best suits them. So the impact of slavery are still there, but we should, at this point in time, be able to move away, from those rhetorics and generate enough unity within the continent of Africa itself, where we can now move on to a period of independence. I mean, true independence, as the word is, one that our leaders are not being pushed, to one corner or the other by various external parties. So I think, we have to focus on that. But it's good to raise these points, as President, Nana did, the Ghanaian president. But I think, at some point in time, Africa needs to move away from that and now rely on what it has on the earth, which is enough mineral resources, and develop institutions and leadership that we can move away and, be a contending partner in the global affairs.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that very thorough analysis. Africa analyst David Otto there speaking about reparations. Of course, that discussion being brought to the forefront by Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo, who made that bold demand during his address at the United Nations General Assembly, which is currently in session.